Welcome back. In a moment we'll examine the life of a modern spy, but first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. Facebook is believed to be working on special software so that it could meet the censorship demands of China. The social media company would neither confirm or deny the existence of such software, but it did state that it was working to better understand the country. Residents in coastal areas of Costa Rica are evacuating as Hurricane Otto continues its destructive path through Central America. Otto's increased its strength as it's made its way through the region, bringing torrential rain and wind speeds of up to 120 kilometers an hour. North Korea has opened its first ever space symposium. It will focus on 6 areas of space science, including satellite manufacture, space materials and elements, and applied technology. Most of us will know the James Bond stories in print or as a movie, tales of great adventure, saving your country by fighting the bad guys with the latest gadgets. In reality, spying is rather more gritty, and when they change sides, even senior figures can be cleverly disposed of. 10 years ago today, a former KGB spy, Alexander Litvinenko, died after drinking some poisonous tea.
The story sounded like the plot of a movie. A former Russian Secret Service officer was poisoned after drinking a pot of tea in a London hotel. Alexander Litvinenko was a staunch critic of Vladimir Putin and was determined to highlight alleged links between the Kremlin and the Russian mafia. His widow Marina claims that at one point her husband went to Putin himself, then the director of the Federal Security Service, to report his allegations, but they fell on deaf ears. In October 2000, he defied an order not to leave Moscow, applying for asylum while transiting through London's Heathrow Airport. For the next 6 years, he was a thorn in the side of the Russian government, unafraid to accuse the political elite. He said all the bloodiest terrorists of the world were connected to Russia's Federal Security Service and the KGB. They were words that cost him his life. In 2006, after meeting 2 former KGB agents at a London hotel, Litvinenko fell ill. Tests revealed he'd ingested the rare and highly toxic radioactive substance polonium-210. He died 3 weeks later. A decade afterwards, a year-long inquiry found that President Putin probably approved the murder, a conclusion that Russia's foreign minister described as slanderous.
Mr. Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, then head of the FSB, and also by President Putin.
Spying is a dangerous business. The whole world is a battleground. Not all wars are fought with guns and bullets, though. Some are waged with information and state-sponsored murder. Ty Genwright, reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that, I'm joined by Ewan Lawson, who is the Senior Research Fellow for Military Influence at the think tank Royal United Services Institute. Ewan, tell us what you can about spies. Governments often don't admit they exist, but they do, don't they?
They do, and they continue to do so, despite people increasingly focused on technology. Ultimately, it's a people business, and therefore there's still a requirement for human-sourced intelligence.
What do they do?
Well, they do a range of things. When you're collecting large quantities of data, then you need some way to know what's important. So you still need to be able to get alongside senior officials, senior military figures, to understand what they're thinking, not just about what they're writing.
So they're often, just like the movies, pretending to be people they're not, using disguise, using guile?
No, there are, of course, cases of that, but to a great extent, recruitment these days is done more openly. It's always been based on the weakness, perhaps, of the individual being targeted, whether that's through a sort of blackmail type approach, or finances, or ego.
And does intel that you get through those routes, it isn't necessarily useful, is it? Because you have to judge, is that person telling you that because you're putting him under pressure, or is that person telling you the truth?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the analysis of any human source will be a combination of the quality of them as a source, you know, how trustworthy are they, how reliable are they, and then the quality of the information they're providing.
What makes a good spy?
I guess, you know, it's the ability to talk to people and to listen.
So
That's
a
the key.
certain charm.
Yeah, more of that than
Or confidence.
More of that than the sort of James Bond sort of, you know, diving in and out of windows stuff. It's much more about the ability to sit and talk and listen.
Do they also get trained, though, to kill people?
I think that varies from country to country. I mean, you know, the UK, for example, does not really have a paramilitary aspect to its intelligence services, either the security service or the secret intelligence service. Other countries, different rules.
Having said that, of course, technology does play an increasing role. And interesting to read how the technology of communications, I suppose if you're trying to get down the bad guys, and let's, as an example, use, let's say, Western governments trying to control what's happening in Syria, the communications to rebels in Syria, to members of Daesh and so on, is it possible to monitor every telephone conversation they are having?
I mean, technically, it's possible to monitor it, but of course, much of it is now done over encrypted links. You know, even the basic encrypted links of something like a WhatsApp or a Telegram type application, which of course means there's a time delay then in being able to analyze it, to see through the encryption, as it were.
See through the encryption.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful euphemism for breaking it,
Yeah,
is it?
absolutely.
And do we assume that government level intelligence officials can do that eventually?
Yes.
But it's just a time factor.
It takes time, and you know, the more complex the encryption is, the longer it will take. But it is, of course, you know, an aspiration of governments to be able to break that encryption.
It's interesting that governments, like, for instance, the British government, I think, is now admitting that in the world of counter-espionage, they've admitted the existence of what I suppose we assumed always was there, which there are computer experts trying to hack the bad guys back.
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing now is a recognition, a formal recognition, if you like, of, as you say, something that's been going on for a while, which is about disrupting the communications of adversaries. It's not the sort of, you know, dramatic things we're perhaps seeing others doing, shutting down the power grid in Western Ukraine, for example. It's more likely to be a combination of making those communication channels difficult to operate, and potentially also putting false message into it, spoofing, as it's called.
Which means messages never get to their intended destination.
Either they never get to their intended destination, or when they do, they don't say exactly what they did when they left.
Oh, right. So you might allow a message to go through, but change its content.
But change its contents.
Or you could, of course, capture a message entirely and then not let on.
Absolutely.
This is all World War II stuff, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
But just in a modern context.
Absolutely.
I said the phrase bad guys, which is, I suppose, a little bit sloppy. If this technology exists, presumably it's going on a government-to-government level as well.
In what sense, sorry?
Well, if we don't like what the Russians are doing, we could try and disrupt them too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a way of operating, you know, below conflict, and certainly there's evidence that the Russians have been doing that, and others, you know, against Western interests.
They stand accused of interfering with Hillary Clinton's election campaign. Do you think that kind of accusation has credibility?
It certainly has some credibility. I mean, the complexity is that the use of the label Russia is not particularly helpful here. I mean, the Russian state, if you like, is a complex organism. There's a group around Putin. There's what we might call the traditional state, including the intelligence agency, and then there's some non-state actors, patriotic hackers and the like. And exactly who is doing what, who is being formally directed, who is just taking initiative, you know, that's unclear. I mean, indeed, in that case, there was evidence of activity by both the FSB, the Internal Security Service, and the GRU, the Military Intelligence Service, in the same servers. That's not something you would do really by design.
Okay, so that brings you to believe that is just a random act of two cultures deciding to do the same thing, or do you think there's direction there from on high?
I think there's a certain amount of direction, but the direction is broad in the way that we would perhaps expect that to be very specific. You know, it would be you are to go and achieve this result through this activity.
Yeah.
This is more a case of go and disrupt.
And Okay, well, this is going maybe conspiracy theory too far, but if they wanted to disrupt the election in America so that Hillary lost and Donald Trump won, they've won, haven't they?
I mean, that's certainly one interpretation. My own personal interpretation is actually this was less about who won and lost, but actually about undermining confidence in democracy.
Tell me about the money, because that's another important part. If we go back to the sort of terror scenarios of various groups around the world, eventually they all need to get funding, and money tends to change hands electronically these days. Is that another area of expertise which security services are having to develop?
Certainly looking at money flows and not just money, but how goods are used to traffic value. Intelligence and law enforcement agencies are having to understand better now how that money moves around. Hence, you saw the Panama Papers as an example of exposing some of those connections.
But they're so complex that you do need dedicated staff, skilled staff, and funnily enough, is it right to surmise that many of the people who might have learnt how to do this nefariously then get turned and actually do it to the benefit of a government or a country? I
think that varies from country to country. I mean, I think the UK position is fairly clear that if you've been prosecuted for something, then you're not going to be put in a position of trust for some time.
However skillful you are in a particular area of science.
Other countries have a more open approach to that.
Okay, well, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today.
Pleasure.
So we end now with our Insight Bite. This is just a little something that we feel you should know. And today it's Uber. And is this the taxi cab of the future? The ride-hailing app has released ambitious plans to have their passengers airborne within a decade. The company says it envisions hubs and landing ports called vertiports that'll be used like terminals, and that passengers will consider the service as normal as taking a train. Self-flying aircraft would cruise at speeds of around 150 miles per hour, and the company estimates a 15-minute flight could cost as little as $21. That's all for the future, but that's all for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.